On the morning of my husband's funeral, I sat in the third pew behind a veil of black lace and watched my daughter laugh. Not a cruel laugh, but a casual one, like the kind you give a coworker in a grocery aisle. She was standing with her cousins, retelling some memories about a beach trip. My husband's name had barely been spoken. I watched her eyes pass over me, as if I were a guest, as if I didn't bleed for her once, as if I hadn't buried a man I loved for 53 years, just 3 feet away. I'm Evelyn Dorsey. I'm 73. And that was the moment I knew my daughter had already buried me. To subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. It was a cold November day in 2023. Gray and draped in fog like the hem of a forgotten curtain, the kind of weather where time feels suspended, like the air holds your breath for you. We held the service at Hillhaven Baptist, the same small chapel where I had married Daniel in 1970, back when I wore my sister's shoes and my mother's pearls. I didn't cry during the ceremony, not once. I had done my weeping the night before, in our empty kitchen, where his coffee mug still sat with a ring of undrunk mourning. The pews were filled not with friends, not really, but with people, neighbors, church folks, the bank manager. My grandson wore AirPods the whole time. My niece kept texting under her hymnal. But it wasn't the irreverence that broke me. It was the silence, the intentional kind, that hush when people avoid your grief like it's a disease they might catch. My daughter Ruth stood to read a passage. I had asked her to choose something meaningful, something her father had loved. She chose Corinthians not because he cherished it, but because it was safe, quick, unemotional. She didn't look at me once while she read. Her voice didn't shake. Her hand didn't tremble. She folded the paper before the last verse was done and returned to her seat like someone finishing a staff report. When she passed my pew, she did not touch my shoulder. She did not meet my eyes. Later, during the reception in the fellowship hall, they served deviled eggs and lemonade from a plastic jug. I stood near the window for almost an hour. No one offered me a plate. I wasn't hungry. I just wanted someone to say, "How are you holding up, Evelyn?" Instead, I listened to my daughter talk about refinancing her kitchen. She joked about how Dad would have hated the granite and laughed again, that same laugh. Too bright, too fast. When she left that evening, she hugged her aunt, hugged her brother, hugged the pastor's wife. She nodded at me, like you might nod at someone who held the door for you at a store. That's all, just a nod. My arms hung like curtains beside me, useless. The door shut behind her before I even took a breath. I sat back down in the empty chapel after everyone left. The candles had burned out, and someone had turned the heat off. My knees hurt, but I didn't move. For the first time since Daniel passed, I didn't cry. I just sat in that cold pew and felt what it meant to be erased, not with malice, but with indifference. There's a difference, you know. Hate is loud, rejection burns, but neglect is quiet, like fog, like mildew, like the slow death of something that once grew wild and bright. The next morning, I went into Daniel's study, a room I hadn't entered since hospice took the hospital bed away. I sat in his leather chair, the one that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and eucalyptus rub. His notary seal lay in the drawer beside a dried-out pen. The will had been signed years ago. Everything split evenly between our children. But that morning, with my hand on the spine of his old Bible, I made a decision. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just said, aloud to the still room, no, she wouldn't inherit my house. The same one she asked me to sell 3 years ago when the plumbing went out. Not out of concern, but because she said, "You don't really need all that space, Mom." No, she wouldn't get my jewelry, the brooches that belonged to her grandmother, the ones she never asked to see. No, she wouldn't be an executor. I'd choose someone who looked me in the eye when I spoke. That morning, I called an attorney. His name was Bill Epperson. He was kind, didn't rush me, let me bring all my notes in a zippered Bible case. I told him I wanted to rewrite the will. I told him, my daughter doesn't see me. He looked up from his paperwork and just nodded. I think he understood. No drama, no letters, no confrontation, just quiet rearrangement. I didn't hate her. I didn't even dislike her. I just realized she had stopped loving me years ago, and she had simply forgotten to tell me. That's a kind of grief they don't write about in books. The grief of being present and yet unseen. The grief of breathing and still being gone. Daniel had passed on a Wednesday. At 4:46 a.m., I remember the clock exactly. I held his hand as he took his last breath. Ruth arrived 6 hours later. fresh from the airport, clutching us. She kissed his forehead, wiped her lipstick off with a tissue, and asked me what the Wi-Fi password was. That should have told me everything, but it took his funeral for me to really see it, to really see her. My name is Evelyn Dorsey. I'm 73, and last November, at my husband's funeral, my daughter ignored me like I was a stranger at a bus stop. That was the moment I realized I had already died in her eyes, and when I rewrote the will, it wasn't out of revenge, it was out of remembrance, of who I was, of what I gave, of what I will no longer be asked to give again. The first time Ruth had a fever, she was 3. It was February 1983, and snow was stacked against the windows of our old duplex in Arlington. Daniel had taken on extra shifts at the train depot, and I was home with both kids, trying to keep the pipes from freezing and the children warm. I remember holding Ruth all night, a wet washcloth folded over her burning forehead, rocking her while the radiator clanked like it was dying. She whimpered in her sleep, murmuring about a rabbit she'd seen in a book, and I whispered stories to keep her still. I hadn't slept in 2 days, but I didn't care. That's what mothers do. That's what I did. Back then, I was all hands and heart, always reaching for something, always pouring out. Daniel and I weren't rich, not even close, but I made magic from coupons and casserole. I remember standing in line at the A&P with $14 in food stamps and a baby on my hip, calculating ounces of powdered milk in my head like sacred math. Every Friday night, I made pancakes in the shape of initials. Ruth always got a butterfly-shaped one, and every Christmas, I sewed their pajamas by hand. They'd wake up to matching flannel and the scent of cinnamon rolls. Ruth liked hers in purple. I never expected applause for any of it. No parades, no poetry, just the occasional thank you, the small moments that made the exhaustion feel like devotion. There was a kind of holiness in the grind. You learn, as a mother, to find God in the grit. When Daniel got laid off in '88, it was my job at the public library that kept us afloat. I'd work Saturdays and evenings, shelving paperbacks and answering reference calls. I still have the name tag, Evelyn. Ask me anything. There were times I'd come home to a sink full of dishes and a daughter who rolled her eyes if dinner wasn't fast enough, but I didn't push back. I thought love meant enduring the eye rolls. Ruth wanted to be seen even when she didn't want to be spoken to. She was brilliant in school, won a spelling bee at 9, started journaling in 6th grade. I kept every page she left lying around, every torn diary scrap, every crumpled drawing. They're in a shoebox in the attic. I don't think she remembers ever giving them to me. I remember her heartbreak from the boy in 11th grade who left her a breakup note on the back of a cafeteria napkin. She came home sobbing, and I held her until her shoulders stopped shaking. I made her tomato soup and let her skip school the next day. She slept in until noon. I called the office and said she had the flu. I didn't tell her, but I cried when she finally fell asleep that night. I hated how the world made her feel. Disposable, I didn't know. Then, I'd become that same kind of disposable. Every birthday, I planned something. Even when we had no money, I made it feel like something. A backyard tea party with paper crowns, a scavenger hunt in the house with clues taped to cabinet doors. For her sweet 16, we couldn't afford a car or a fancy dinner, so I turned the garage into a dance floor, twinkle lights, balloons from the dollar store. Her friends came, they laughed, they danced. I watched from the kitchen with a smile that didn't fade until well after midnight. She never knew I pawned my wedding bracelet to rent the speakers. These aren't complaints. These are memories, threaded into me like breath. I did the same for my son, of course. Andrew had different needs, quieter, more internal, but he was no less loved. When he got suspended in 10th grade for something he didn't do, I marched into that principal's office with a binder of proof and my Sunday voice. I made sure they apologized. I made sure he knew he was believed. I fought for both of them. Again and again, Daniel used to say. I kept the house like a museum. Not because it was pristine. Lord knows we had clutter, but because every object told a story. The quilt on the couch, hand-stitched by my Aunt Ruth, the woman my daughter was named after. The ceramic angel in the hallway, a gift from my mother on the day we bought our first home. Even the chipped mug by the sink, Daniel's favorite. The one that said "Number 1 Dad" in faded letters, had survived 3 kitchen renovations. I guarded these things like a curator, preserving not just objects, but meaning. And in between the giving and the fixing, I kept the secrets. I absorbed the hard things so others wouldn't have to. When Daniel's mother fell ill and we took her in, it was me who bathed her, me who cleaned her bedsheets at midnight, me who sat through her dementia-riddled rants without ever raising my voice. Ruth was in college then, visiting on holidays. She'd pat her grandma's hand, smile politely, and retreat to her room with her phone. I never held it against her. I told myself she was young. I told myself she had her own grief. We all do. And maybe that's where I made the mistake. I let them need me too long without ever asking them to see me. I gave and gave and gave, and when I finally looked up, I had become a piece of furniture, something useful, some background, something no one thanks, until it breaks. When Ruth had her children, I babysat 3 days a week while she finished grad school. I made them soup when they were sick, picked them up when daycare ran long, brought over lasagna when her husband traveled. I never said no, not once, even when my back hurts. Even when Daniel was in the early stages of forgetting where he put his keys, or what day it was. I remember one afternoon, I took my grandson to the park. He was 4. We fed ducks, built castles in the sand, and sang the alphabet song on a bench while the sun went down. When Ruth came to pick him up, she barely said thank you, just nodded, like she always did, and buckled him into the car without looking up. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and wondered when she had last asked me how I was doing. I couldn't remember, but I dismissed the thought, because that's what mothers do. We make excuses for the silence. Now, all these years later, I can list every lunch packed, every fever cooled, every bedtime story read 3 times because the first 2 weren't good enough. I remember every recital I clapped through with cracked hands. Every night I stayed awake just in case the phone rang with bad news. I remember. But I wonder if they do. Because what happens to the memory of a mother once she stops being needed? Does she fade into the wallpaper? Or does she wait, like I did in the pew of a quiet funeral, watching the people she raised drift past her as if grief didn't stick to her skin the same way? I don't ask for gratitude. Never did. But there's a difference between not being thanked and being forgotten, and the ache of that difference. Well, it builds, quietly, like a tide, 100 quiet hurts, waiting for the moon to rise. It's not just one moment that unravels you, not usually, not the sharp cut of a single betrayal. No, it's the accumulation, the steady weight of being overlooked in 100 different ways until one day, you forget how light you used to feel. After the funeral, I started noticing the silence more than ever. The kind that hums between phone rings that never come. The kind that lingers in the air after a brief text that says busy today or next weekend maybe. I used to be someone whose calendar was filled with school plays, grocery runs, family dinners, but now, my days are blank. My name, once written in their lives with ink, was now penciled and easily erased. I'd sit at the kitchen table, the same table where Ruth used to color outside the lines with her tongue pressed between her lips. That table had hosted birthday cakes, spilled milk, heated arguments, and whispered apologies. Now it held grocery circulars, unopened mail, and my hands folded, waiting. I began counting how many days passed between her calls. Then I stopped, because it hurt more to know the number. When Daniel's memory began to fray, it was me who covered for him. He'd forget names, forget the stove, forget the year. I shielded the children from the truth for as long as I could. I told them he was just tired, that age played tricks on the mind. I cleaned up after the forgotten pans and turned off the tap he left running. I didn't want them to see him like that. I thought I was preserving their image of their father, but maybe I was just giving them an excuse not to come around. They didn't visit often, and when they did, the visits were short, always some event, some conflict, always something else, pulling them away. They'd leave with leftovers I packed in foil, kisses on cheeks, and promised to come back soon. But soon kept stretching further. One afternoon, I dropped a jar of olives in the kitchen. It shattered across the linoleum, brine and glass everywhere. I stood there, just staring at the mess. My hands trembled, and for a second, I didn't move. Not because I couldn't, but because I wondered if anyone would know if I didn't. I cleaned it up slowly, using paper towels and silence. I didn't tell anyone it had happened. That became a pattern. It's strange how your body remembers care. I still set out 2 mugs for coffee every morning, even after Daniel passed. One stayed empty, but I couldn't break the habit. I'd find myself folding laundry and reaching for shirts that no longer had a back to wear them. I'd instinctively save half a dessert for Ruth, forgetting that she hadn't been by in weeks, maybe months. Then came the holidays. That first Christmas after Daniel passed, I decorated the house alone. I hung his stocking anyway, put out the little wooden train that always sat under the tree. I made his favorite cranberry bread. Ruth didn't come. She sent a package with a framed photo of the grandkids. No card, no call, just a return address and a cold kind of cheer. I placed it on the mantel anyway, because I didn't know what else to do. Even the mail began to feel like a reminder of my erasure. Catalogs addressed to resident, birthday cards for the neighbors' kids, medical bills, but nothing personal. Nothing with my name written by someone who remembered my middle name or asked about my garden. There were other slights, too, subtle things. Ruth changed plans without telling me, calling only when she needed something. Once, she asked if I could wire her some money because her husband's business had a slow quarter. I sent it, of course. $2,000 from the savings Daniel and I had built for emergencies. She didn't call to say it arrived. I saw the deposit clear, but no thank you followed. Another time, she asked me to watch the children for a weekend while they went to a wedding. I was exhausted. My knees were aching, and I had just gotten over bronchitis. But I said yes. I always did. When she came back, she barely asked how I was feeling. She picked up the kids, gave me a tired wave, and left. The house was quiet again, the kind that rings in your ears. I didn't expect medals for mothering. I didn't expect poems or praise. But I thought love, when given freely for so long, might grow roots. I thought it would tether us. I see now that I was wrong. There were birthdays missed, too. Mine, not theirs. For the last 3 years, Ruth either forgot or sent a message late in the day. A casual hope. It's a good one, with a few emojis. No call, no card. No visit. 1 year, I made myself a lemon cake and cut a slice for a friend who never showed. I lit a candle, I sang softly, blew it out, pretended the wish mattered. I started seeing a neighbor more regularly. Helen, she's 76, lives 2 doors down. We'd have tea on Fridays. One day she said, "You're always so quiet, Evelyn, like you're listening for something that never arrives." That sat with me, because she was right. I had become a woman listening for footsteps that never came. A voice that never called my name. Even church became hard. The pew where Daniel and I used to sit felt too large, too empty. I started sitting near the back. People would ask about Ruth, about Andrew. How's the family? They'd say. I'd smile, say good, busy. But I didn't really know, and they didn't ask again. The worst part wasn't the absence, it was the forgetting when they started making decisions without me. Selling the vacation home without even telling me. Planning family events and sending photos afterward. There was a gathering at Ruth's house, a big dinner, cousins and laughter. I saw it on social media, a photo of everyone raising a toast. I wasn't invited. No one mentioned it. I sat in my living room that night, watching the flames flicker in the fireplace, wondering when exactly I became optional, the final image of me in their lives. It seems, is one of quiet service, a woman who was always available, always giving. Always on the edge of their story, never in the center. That's what these quiet hurts are. Not daggers, not explosions, but erosion. A slow dissolution of presence. Like being painted over, layer by layer, until the wall forgets it was ever your color. And each time it happened, the missed call, the unreturned favor, the forgotten celebration, I'd tell myself it wasn't a big deal, that people get busy, that life gets noisy, but deep down, something inside me was keeping count, not out of bitterness, out of grief, because love, when unseen, becomes sorrow, and sorrow, left too long, becomes silence, and eventually, that silence becomes a choice, a quiet one, but sharp all the same. It happened on a Thursday. I remember because it had rained the whole morning, and the front path was slick with wet leaves. I had just made myself a cup of teachamel with a bit of honey and was settling into Daniel's old armchair when I noticed the envelope. It had been pushed through the door, hand-delivered, no postage. My name was scribbled in quick strokes, not Ruth's handwriting, but I knew it came from her. Inside was a typed letter, no greeting, just a statement of facts. They had sold the lake house, the one Daniel and I had bought with our savings back in 1995, a small, quiet place in Vermont, with creaky floors and a dock that needed staining every spring. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. We had painted the shutters navy blue and planted wildflowers around the back porch. Daniel had caught his last fish there, the summer before his memory began to drift. He'd cried that day, holding the trout in his hands, not because of the fish, but because he remembered how it felt to remember. We hadn't visited the house in recent years. My knees didn't like the stairs, and the drive felt longer with every passing season. But it was never about the ease of going. It was knowing it was there. The idea that somewhere, beyond the daily ache of routine, existed a quiet space that belonged to us. I thought it would go to the children one day. I imagined Ruth's boys fishing off the same dock, their laughter echoing across the still water. But that morning, holding that letter in my lap, I realized they had taken that from me, sold it, without asking, without even telling me, until it was done. The paperwork, I later found out, had been signed 2 weeks after Daniel's funeral, while I was still folding his clothes into boxes I hadn't opened since. They had used the power of attorney, something Daniel had established years ago, back when we trusted the idea of shared stewardship. Ruth had filed the documents herself, quietly, efficiently, legally. I called her that afternoon. She didn't answer. Instead, she sent a short message. It didn't make sense to keep it, Mom. No one was using it. The taxes were a drain. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. That was all she said. No apology. No acknowledgement of what it meant. Just numbers. Just logic. But that place didn't have numbers. It was where I held Ruth after her first heartbreak, wrapped in an old quilt, feeding her grilled cheese as rain danced on the tin roof. It was where Daniel kissed me on our 40th anniversary, barefoot on the grass, whispering promises he still remembered then. It was where we scattered his brother's ashes, right under the cedar tree, and sang Amazing Grace with cracked voices and swollen eyes. She had reduced all of that to a line item on a spreadsheet. I sat at the kitchen table that night, tracing the outline of the mug in my hand. I didn't cry, I didn't shout, but something inside me stopped reaching forward, like a train pulling slowly into its last station, engine quiet, lights dimmed. The next week, I went to the county clerk's office. I asked for a copy of the transaction. The woman behind the desk was kind. She printed the forms, handed them over with a sympathetic look I didn't ask for. As I flipped through the pages, I saw the signature. Not mine, not Daniel's. Ruth's single quotes as she had signed, as if I were incapable, as if I no longer had a voice. And maybe, in her eyes, I don't think it was malicious. That's the thing that hurt the most. I don't think she meant to wound me. I think I had become so absent in her mind, so silent in her world, that she didn't think of me at all. And isn't that its own kind of cruelty? Not being hated, just being overlooked. That night, I pulled out the old tin box where Daniel and I kept our records, birth certificates, property deeds, the original will. I hadn't looked at those documents since we'd updated them in 2012. My hands trembled as I unfolded the pages. My name, his name, our wishes. Ruth and Andrew listed clearly, equal shares, a neat division of a life lived together. I sat with it for a long time. Then I placed it back in the tin, slid the box under my bed, and laid down without changing clothes. I stared at the ceiling for hours, not angry, just hollow, like someone who had been quietly robbed, not of possessions, but of place. The next day, I made an appointment with Bill Epperson, the lawyer who'd helped us years ago. He looked older, softer around the eyes. He greeted me kindly, asked if I needed water. I told him what had happened, the house, the signature, the silence. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, I said simply, I'd like to update my will. He nodded. I didn't go into the reasons. I didn't need to. It was clear on my face, I think, that deep kind of hurt you don't name out loud, because it changes shape the moment you do. We spent 2 hours reviewing everything. I removed Ruth as executor. I reallocated the estate. I left a portion to the church, a portion to a scholarship fund for girls in public libraries, and I placed the rest in a trust for Andrew's children under the condition that Ruth would have no control over it. Not out of spite, out of protection. For me, for them. When I left the office, I walked to the park across the street, sat on a bench under a dogwood tree, and watched a pair of robins build a nest. The branches were thin, the wind was gentle, but still, they worked, carefully, silently. They didn't know if the nest would last, but they built it anyway, and I thought maybe that's what we do in the end. We build something new from what we have left, even if it's smaller, even if it's quieter, even if it's just for ourselves. A week later, Ruth called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. Hey, Just checking in. Haven't heard from you. Is everything okay? I saved the message, not because I believed in the check-in, but because I wanted to remember the sound of her voice when she still thought she knew me. What she didn't know was that something had shifted. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to explain. I wasn't going to ask to be seen anymore. Some lines, once crossed, don't get redrawn, and the moment I saw her signature on that sale was the moment I realized my memories, my place, my part in this family could be signed away like a bill. I knew the giving was done, not out of punishment, but out of peace. It didn't happen all at once. I didn't slam a door or scream into a pillow or write some dramatic letter declaring my departure from their lives. That was never my way. No, my silence came like the first frost in October. Slow, invisible, but final. One morning, there's dew on the grass. Next, everything tender has turned crisp. I stopped reaching first. That was the beginning. There were birthdays missed, too. Mine, not theirs. For the last 3 years, Ruth either forgot or sent a message late in the day. A casual hope, it's a good one with a few emojis. No call, no card, no visit. One year, I made myself a lemon cake and cut a slice for a friend who never showed. I lit a candle, I sang softly, blew it out, pretended the wish mattered. I started seeing a neighbor more regularly. Helen, she's 76, lives 2 doors down. We'd have tea on Fridays. One day she said, "You're always so quiet, Evelyn, like you're listening for something that never arrives." That sat with me. Because she was right. I had become a woman listening for footsteps that never came, a voice that never called my name. Even church became hard. The pew where Daniel and I used to sit felt too large, too empty. I started sitting near the back. People would ask about Ruth, about Andrew. How's the family? They'd say. I'd smile, say, good, busy. But I didn't really know, and they didn't ask again. The worst part wasn't the absence. It was the forgetting. When they started making decisions without me, selling the vacation home without even telling me, planning family events, and sending photos afterward. There was a gathering at Ruth's house, a big dinner, cousins, and laughter. I saw it on social media. A photo of everyone raising a toast. I wasn't invited. No one mentioned it. I sat in my living room that night, watching the flames flicker in the fireplace, wondering when exactly I became optional. The final image of me in their lives, it seems, is one of quiet service. A woman who was always available, always giving, always on the edge of their story, never in the center. That's what these quiet hurts are. Not daggers, not explosions, but erosion. A slow dissolution of presence, like being painted over, layer by layer, until the wall forgets it was ever your color. And each time it happened, the missed call, the unreturned favor, the forgotten celebration, I'd tell myself it wasn't a big deal. That people get busy, that life gets noisy. But deep down, something inside me was keeping count. Not out of bitterness, out of grief. Because love, when unseen, becomes sorrow. And sorrow, left too long, becomes silence. And eventually, that silence becomes a choice. A quiet one, but sharp all the same. It happened on a Thursday. I remember, because it had rained the whole morning, and the front path was slick with wet leaves. I had just made myself a cup of teachamol, with a bit of honey, and was settling into Daniel's old armchair when I noticed the envelope had been pushed through the door, hand-delivered, no postage. My name was scribbled in quick strokes, not Ruth's handwriting, but I knew it came from her. Inside was a typed letter, no greeting, just a statement of facts. They had sold the lake house, the one Daniel and I had bought with our savings back in 1995, a small, quiet place in Vermont, with creaky floors and a dock that needed staining every spring. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. We had painted the shutters navy blue and planted wildflowers around the back porch. Daniel had caught his last fish there. The summer before his memory began to drift. He'd cried that day, holding the trout in his hands, not because of the fish, but because he remembered how it felt to remember. We hadn't visited the house in recent years. My knees didn't like the stairs, and the drive felt longer with every passing season, but it was never about the ease of going. It was knowing it was there. The idea that somewhere, beyond the daily ache of routine, existed a quiet space that belonged to us. I thought it would go to the children one day. I imagined Ruth's boys fishing off the same dock, their laughter echoing across the still water. But that morning, Holding that letter in my lap, I realized they had taken that from me, sold it, without asking, without even telling me until it was done. The paperwork, I later found out, had been signed 2 weeks after Daniel's funeral, while I was still folding his clothes into boxes I hadn't opened since. They had used the power of attorney, something Daniel had established years ago, back when we trusted the idea of shared stewardship. Ruth had filed the documents herself, quietly, efficiently, legally. I called her that afternoon. She didn't answer. Instead, she sent a short message. It didn't make sense to keep it, Mom. No one was using it. The taxes were a drain. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. That was all she said. No apology. No acknowledgement of what it meant. Just numbers. Just logic. But that place didn't have numbers. It was where I held Ruth after her first heartbreak, wrapped in an old quilt, feeding her grilled cheese as rain danced on the tin roof. It was where Daniel kissed me on our 40th anniversary, barefoot on the grass, whispering promises he still remembered then. It was where we scattered his brother's ashes, right under the cedar tree, and sang Amazing Grace with cracked voices and swollen eyes. She had reduced all of that to a line item on a spreadsheet. I sat at the kitchen table that night, tracing the outline of the mug in my hand. I didn't cry, I didn't shout, but something inside me stopped reaching forward. Like a train pulling slowly into its last station, engine quiet, lights dimmed. The next week, I went to the county clerk's office. I asked for a copy of the transaction. The woman behind the desk was kind. She printed the forms, handed them over with a sympathetic look I didn't ask for. As I flipped through the pages, I saw the signature. Not mine, not Daniel's. Ruth's single quotes as she had signed, as if I were incapable, as if I no longer had a voice. And maybe, in her eyes, I didn't. I don't think it was malicious. That's the thing that hurt the most. I don't think she meant to wound me. I think I had become so absent in her mind, so silent in her world, that she didn't think of me at all. And isn't that its own kind of cruelty? Not being hated, just being overlooked. That night, I pulled out the old tin box where Daniel and I kept our records, birth certificates, property deeds, the original will. I hadn't looked at those documents since we'd updated them in 2012. My hands trembled as I unfolded the pages. My name, his name, our wishes, Ruth and Andrew listed clearly. Equal shares, a neat division of a life lived together. I sat with it for a long time. Then I placed it back in the tin, slid the box under my bed, and laid down without changing clothes. I stared at the ceiling for hours, not angry, just hollow, like someone who had been quietly robbed, not of possessions, but of place. The next day, I made an appointment with Bill Epperson, the lawyer who'd helped us years ago. He looked older, softer around the eyes. He greeted me kindly, asked if I needed water. I told him what had happened. The house, the signature, the silence. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, I said simply, I'd like to update my will. He nodded. I didn't go into the reasons. I didn't need to. It was clear on my face. I think that deep kind of hurt you don't name out loud, because it changes shape the moment you do. We spent 2 hours reviewing everything. I removed Ruth as executor. I reallocated the estate. I left a portion to the church, a portion to a scholarship fund for girls in public libraries, and I placed the rest in a trust for Andrew's children, under the condition that Ruth would have no control over it, not out of spite, out of protection. For me, for them. When I left the office, I walked to the park across the street, sat on a bench under a dogwood tree, and watched a pair of robins build a nest. The branches were thin, the wind was gentle, but still, they worked, carefully, silently. They didn't know if the nest would last, but they built it anyway, and I thought maybe that's what we do in the end. We build something new from what we have left, even if it's smaller, even if it's quieter, even if it's just for ourselves. A week later, Ruth called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. Hey, just checking in. Haven't heard from you. Is everything okay? I saved the message, not because I believed in the check-in, but because I wanted to remember the sound of her voice when she still thought she knew me. What she didn't know was that something had shifted. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to explain. I wasn't going to ask to be seen anymore. Some lines, once crossed, don't get redrawn. And the moment I saw her signature on that sale was the moment I realized my memories, my place, my part in this family could be signed away like a bill I knew. The giving was done, not out of punishment, but out of peace. It didn't happen all at once. I didn't slam a door or scream into a pillow or write some dramatic letter declaring my departure from their lives. That was never my way. No, my silence came like the first frost in October. Slow, invisible, but final. One morning, there's dew on the grass. Next, everything tender has turned crisp. I stopped reaching first. That was the beginning. No more texts checking in. No more polite emojis sent in response to photos of my grandsons at their soccer games or Halloween parades. No reminders about flu shots or birthday cards mailed 2 weeks early. I still remembered the dates. I just chose not to move my hands. It was a strange thing, at first. Like putting down a bag you've carried so long, your arms don't know what to do. I had been holding the weight of our family's togetherness for so many years, stitching it back together each time it frayed, pretending it was strong because I needed to believe it. But silence, I learned, is its own kind of repair. Not of the past, but of oneself. I cleared out the guest room, not dramatically, just slowly. I folded the extra towels, boxed the toys, and donated the crib sheets I'd kept just in case. I rearranged the room into a kind of study, a small desk, a reading lamp, my sewing machine. It became a space for me, though it took weeks before I actually sat in it. I didn't answer the next 3 calls from Ruth. Her voicemails came as if nothing had shifted. Hey, can you talk tomorrow? Wanted to run something by you. Forgot to ask, do you still have Dad's fishing gear? Might be nice for the boys. Just wanted to say hi. Hope you're good. They weren't cruel, but they weren't aware, either. She was still speaking to the version of me that would have said yes to anything. I let the messages stack up like unopened mail. I listened to them once, then deleted them. That part felt new. Then Hasavin, the permission to let go. I began walking in the early evenings, just down the block and back. Sometimes, as far as the old train tracks near Elm Street where Daniel used to take the kids to watch freight cars rumble by. I liked the way the air felt right before sunset, when everything glowed a little, but didn't ask to be noticed. There was peace in that, a kind of softness I hadn't felt in years. It was around that time I found the old ledger, tucked in a drawer beneath some placemats I hadn't used since 2009. Daniel's handwriting, neat and slanted, filled the pages with budgets, notes, and small entries like $47, roof patch and Ruth piano, money minus $1,997. I flipped through the pages slowly, touched his words with my fingers as if they could pulse. Then, toward the back, I found something else, a letter, not mailed, just folded into the spine. It was addressed to me, Evelyn. It was written in 2014, before the memory started to leave him. Before the confusion and forgetting and sadness clouded his beautiful, steady mind. He wrote it after one of our bigger arguments about the kids. I remember the night, though not the fight. I remember the silence afterward, long, but not cruelly. In the letter he wrote, "You give too much, Evie, not because you shouldn't, but because you forget to keep any for yourself. They'll let you. That's not their fault. That's human. But you have to stop treating your love like it's the ocean. Let some of it be the shore." I read it twice, then once more aloud. His voice filled the room. I could almost smell his aftershave, feel the warm indent of where he used to sit on the couch. That night, I sat in the study and wrote down everything I had stopped saying. Not to send, just to see it for myself. I wrote that I had been afraid of becoming invisible, so I made myself indispensable instead. That I thought if I was useful enough, loving enough, present enough, they wouldn't forget me. But they had, not with cruelty, not even on purpose, but they had, all the same. I wrote that I missed being asked how I was, that I couldn't remember the last time Ruth looked me in the eye for longer than a second, that I had begun to feel like a piece of old furniture kept for sentiment but never truly noticed. And then I wrote this: I am not a ghost. I am not a servant. I am not a storage place for everyone else's memories. After that, the quiet became easier. I made a list of everything I still wanted to learn. It was short, at first: how to make lavender soap, how to plant tulips from bulbs instead of pots, how to use that food processor Daniel bought in 2006 that I'd never opened. Little things, but they mattered, because they were mine. I called the library and asked about volunteer hours. Started coming in twice a week to shelve new arrivals and run the senior book club on Thursdays. I met a woman named Jo who wore mismatched earrings and told wonderful stories about her years in Maine. We started meeting for coffee, just two women, no roles to play, no expectations. I sold the old Buick, too big, too loud. Bought a used hatchback, in teal, a color Daniel would have called sassy. I loved it. I named her Ruthie, a small rebellion, a quiet reclaiming dot. Then one morning, I called Bill again, the lawyer. I asked him about trust, about how to shield it, about how to ensure that when I was gone, the choices I made couldn't be undone by anyone else. We talked for a long time. He helped me revise things, tighten the language, and write the fine print with intention. I left his office lighter than I'd arrived. I didn't tell anyone. That's the thing about silence when it's chosen. It becomes strength. Not hiding. Just deciding what no longer needs to be explained. I don't think Ruth noticed right away. People don't, when the caretakers go quiet. At first, she probably assumed I was tired, or busy, or in one of my moods. I had trained her, after all, to believe I would always return with softness, no matter the slight. But the weeks stretched, then months. Andrew called once, asking if something had happened. I told him I was fine. I didn't go into detail, just said I was taking time for myself. He said he understood. I think, maybe, he did. I went silent, not to punish, but to remember how my own voice sounded when it wasn't being used to comfort everyone else. And in that silence, something beautiful began to bloom, a kind of stillness that wasn't empty, a space that felt like mine, a place where I could be, fully, quietly, entirely Evelyn. The first thing I did was stop narrating my life to them in my head. For years, whenever something happened, whenever I made a particularly good stew, or the roses bloomed early, or I stumbled across an old photo, I'd think, I'll tell Ruth about this, as if she were still listening, as if she'd pick up the phone, or show up at my door, or sit across the kitchen table with that half smile that used to mean she saw me. But I let that go. I stopped framing my world through her eyes. Instead, I let it be mine. The mornings began to shift. I woke up earlier, not from habit but from desire. There was something about the way the light came through the east window in April, soft and gold. Like a memory I wanted to keep warm. I started sitting by the window with my coffee. No rádio, no noise, just birdsong and the distant hum of a world that didn't need me to fix it. I made oatmeal with cinnamon and pears. I took the time to slice them thin. I bought a journal from the little gift shop near the pharmacy, dark green, with a leather tie. I began writing, not about them, but about me, about what I remembered, what I missed, what I hoped for, even if it was small. A walk without knee pain, a new novel worth finishing, a day without the echo of disappointment. I started reading poetry again, Billy Collins, Mary Oliver, the kinds of poems that don't try to impress you, just sit beside you like a quiet friend. I rearranged the furniture. That sounds trivial, I know, but it wasn't. It was a statement. I moved Daniel's chair out of the corner where it had sat untouched since he passed. I donated it to the church. I replaced it with a pale blue armchair that hugged my back just right. It looked out the window. A small table beside it held a lamp and a cup of pens. I began spending hours there, reading, journaling, sometimes just looking at the clouds. I didn't tell Ruth, or Andrew, or anyone that was mine. Jo, my friend from the library, invited me to a watercolor class at the rec center. I hesitated at first. I hadn't painted since Ruth was in middle school. She used to love it until she didn't, until other things became more important. But I went. It was Tuesday at 10 a.m. The room smelled like pencil shavings and acrylic. The instructor was a retired art teacher with wild gray curls and a voice like warm gravel. She told us not to worry about being good. Just honest. My first painting was of a mug on a windowsill. The light slanted across it like a small secret. I took it home and pinned it on the fridge. I started painting every week. Not because I had talent, but because it quieted something loud inside me. Jo and I grew closer. We'd meet for coffee after class, sometimes walk through the farmer's market on Saturdays. She had 2 daughters, both living far away, both polite but distant. We never needed to say much. Our friendship lived in the pauses, in the easy way we could be alone together. One afternoon, she said, "You're softer now, Lesfred." I smiled, because I felt it too. The edges of me that used to tear open so easily, they were healing. not hardened, just no longer so quick to bleed. I started cooking again, not for anyone else, but for the pleasure of it. Tomato bisque from scratch, lemon chicken with rosemary from my own little herb pot. I plated the food nicely, sat at the table with a napkin and a glass of water like I was worth the effort, and I began saving not money, not exactly, but energy. I paid more attention to where I placed my thoughts, who I gave them to. I stopped replaying old arguments in my head, stopped rehearsing what I might say if Ruth ever apologized. I didn't need an apology anymore. I needed peace, so I made it. I made peace by pruning my rose bushes with care, by sending a donation to the library every month, by sorting through old clothes and keeping only what made me feel alive. I gave away the beige sweaters, the ones Ruth used to say looked age-appropriate. I bought a crimson scarf instead, and a lipstick to match. I even started attending a writing circle on Thursday nights, just 6 of us in the back room of the library, sharing stories that had been held too long inside. Most people wrote fiction. I didn't. I wrote about my life, in fragments. About the sound of Daniel's laugh when he forgot he was sick. About the weight of silence in a house that used to breathe. One evening, after I read a piece aloud about my wedding day, a man named Charles said quietly, "That felt like a memory with skin." It stayed with me. That's what I wanted to build. Now, memories with skin. Things I could touch. Things I could choose. I made new decisions. I updated the documents Bill had prepared. I set up a scholarship in Daniel's name for students studying history at the local community college. I gave a portion of my savings to the community garden. I even bought a small bench to be placed at the park near the duck pond. Daniel's pond, I called it. No plaque, just a bench, for sitting, for watching, for remembering. I didn't tell Ruth about any of it. That silence, still intact, had become something I wore like a shawl. Not armor, not a wall, just warmth, just mine. Andrew reached out more, gently. He started sending postcards from the places he traveled for work, Arizona, Vermont, one even from Paris. Short notes. "Thought of you when I saw this. Hope your tomatoes are growing." I wrote back, not out of obligation, but because he was trying, because I felt no need to protect myself from him. But Ruth remained quiet. Or maybe she wasn't. Maybe she was calling, texting, leaving breadcrumbs I chose not to follow. Either way, I didn't look, because I had moved differently, not away, just onward. And onward was a place with open windows and room to stretch. It was not built from bitterness. It was built from the understanding that some relationships do not end in fights. They end in the decision to no longer chase after what refuses to stay. And when I stopped chasing, I finally had the strength to walk toward something, not someone. And that made all the difference. It wasn't immediate. The shift, it never is. People don't feel your absence right away. Not when they've grown used to your presence being guaranteed. But absence has its own kind of echo. Not a bang, not a scream, but a hollow note that keeps ringing long after they think they've stopped listening. It was sometime in early August when the first ripple came. I remember because the crickets had just begun their evening songs again, louder than usual, and I had left the windows open to let the breeze in. The phone rang. I let it go. The answering machine picked up that old recorded message Daniel and I had made back when our voices still fit together. It was Ruth, double quotes, "Hi Mom. I haven't heard from you. Just wanted to see if everything's all right. Give me a call, okay?" Her voice was softer than I remembered, like she wasn't sure of her footing, like someone reaching for a light switch in the dark. I didn't return the call, not because I was angry, not to hurt her, but because I no longer felt the impulse to explain myself, and I think that, more than anything, unsettled her. For years, I had been the constant, the reminder, the gentle nudge, the planner of holidays, the buyer of gifts, the one who remembered to pack extra socks for the boys and send flowers on the anniversary of her wedding. When that presence disappeared, the scaffolding began to loosen. The family rhythm I used to keep like clockwork fell slightly off beat. I heard about it first from Jo. She volunteers at the same church pantry Ruth occasionally supports during fundraising season. Apparently Ruth had come by with her boys in tow, trying to organize a small event. She looked flustered, unprepared. She'd forgotten the names of 2 of the elders and brought the wrong forms. Jo said she kept looking at her phone between sentences. She seemed lost, Jo told me later, stirring cream into her coffee, like someone who just realized they were walking without a map. I nodded. I knew that feeling well. 2 weeks later, I got a letter in the mail, not typed, handwritten. The envelope was pale blue, the kind I used to keep in the desk drawer next to the stamps. My name was written with effort, not in her confident, slanted script from years past, but slower, as if she wasn't sure how to begin. Inside, 3 short paragraphs. She said she missed me. Said she didn't understand why I had gone quiet, but that she felt it deeply. Said the boys asked about me often. Said they missed the stories, the soup. She ended it with, "I'm sorry, Mom. If I've done something to drive you away, I want to make it right." I placed the letter in the drawer beside Daniel's reading glasses. I didn't answer. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I wanted her to sit with the ache. The same ache I had carried for years, the same hollow that comes from giving and giving, only to find yourself alone in the aftermath. Sometimes, the only way to understand someone's silence is to hear your own echo in it. Over time, more messages came. A few from Andrew too, though. He were quieter, more like gentle taps on a door he wasn't sure he had the right to knock on. He never asked me to explain myself, just sent photos, updates, bits of life, like offerings. One from Paris, a street musician playing the violin, captioned, "Thought of you." He played Moon River. I smiled when I saw it, not because it pulled me back, but because it didn't have to. Andrew didn't need anything from me. He just wanted to share a moment. That difference matters. As summer gave way to fall, I began noticing other signs of their absence, not in my life, but in theirs. The holidays came. There was no Thanksgiving gathering that year. Ruth tried. She sent out an email. I know because Joe's niece, who's connected through the church, mentioned it to me, but no one replied. Not right away. Eventually, the dinner was canceled. I imagined her at home, a half-set table, a turkey she didn't know how to baste. No card from me in the mail. No cranberry sauce in mason jars. No centerpiece made from pine cones and twine. It was never just food. It was care, ritual, memory. And without it, everything tastes different. Christmas came next. I didn't put up a tree that year. Didn't hang a single light. Instead, I took a train north, stayed in a small cottage through New Year's. It had snow-dusted windows and a fireplace that crackled like an old friend telling stories. I read 3 novels, walked through frozen woods, and drank cocoa by myself. I was not lonely. I was alone. And there's a difference. When I returned, my voicemail box was full. Mostly Ruth. "I'm worried about you. Please call me. Why are you shutting me out?" I didn't erase them, but I didn't respond either. I think that's when she started to feel the shape of my absence. Not as punishment, but as reality. You don't realize how much someone holds until their hands go still. She had never been forced to organize without me, to host without me, to remember birthdays without the gentle reminder of my voice. She had never felt the true weight of holding a family together. Now, she did. Even the boys began to notice. I received a drawing in the mail from the youngest, an uneven heart in crayon with "We miss you, Nana" spelled backwards. It was sweet, it was sincere, but I still didn't go back, because I had nothing left to prove. I had carried them for decades now. They would learn to stand at the library one Thursday. Joe said, "You know you've changed." I looked at her. "Not in a bad way," she added quickly. "You're just centered now, like someone who reclaimed her name." That night, I sat in my study and wrote it down. My name, Evelyn, not Mom, not Nana, not the fixer, the cook, the planner, just Evelyn. And I thought, for the first time in years, maybe that was enough. They lost me, not forever, but in the way you lose a tree you thought would always be there, until one day, you turn, and it's gone. And you realize it wasn't just shade, it was a shelter, it was a memory, it was the sound of someone always answering, even when you forgot to ask kindly. And when that sound is gone, you start to hear yourself differently. I hope they are listening now, not to my voice, but to the silence I left behind. I wrote the letter on a quiet Tuesday morning in late March. The air was still, the kind of still that feels deliberate, as if the world itself had paused to hear something. A soft rain tapped the windows, slow and rhythmic, and I remember the smell of coffee lingering in the kitchen, just the way Daniel liked it, strong and a little burnt. I hadn't planned to write anything. I sat at my little desk near the window, as I often did now, flipping through old recipe cards I no longer used but couldn't throw away. My fingers landed on one, written in Ruth's 12-year-old scrawl, "Mom's best cookies," complete with a smiley face and hearts over the eyes. I don't know what made me pick up the pen, but I did. Not the quick blue ballpoint I used for grocery lists, but the heavier fountain pen Daniel gave me one Christmas in the 70s, when he still wrote love notes on index cards and tucked them in my coat pocket. I uncapped it slowly, placed a fresh sheet of thick paper on the desk, and began to write. The letter was not for Ruth, it was for me, or rather, for the woman I had been. Evelyn, age 41, the version of me who had just come home from work, still in her sensible heels, carrying a paper sack of groceries and a heart full of everyone else's needs. The woman who knew which kid had the dentist that week, which casserole needed baking for the church, which socks Daniel hated and why. The woman who still believed she would one day be seen for everything she did in silence. That version of me. I started simply, "Dear Evelyn, I see you." I paused, letting the words settle in the space between my breaths. Then I wrote, "I see the way you tiptoe around other people's moods, the way you soften your words so no one feels ashamed, the way you say I'm fine when your chest is full of stones. I see the lists you carry in your head, the ones no one else ever offers to hold. I see how you keep showing up, even when you're tired down to the bone." The pen moved slowly, each word a step through years of forgotten weather. I wrote to Evelyn, who stayed silent during arguments for the sake of peace. To the one who saved the last piece of pie for everyone else. To the one who answered midnight phone calls with steadiness, never asking for comfort in return. "I see how often you go unseen," I wrote. "And I want you to know it's not because you're invisible, it's because you are whole. And wholeness does not always shout." I wrote about the love I gave away to isolate, about the moments I thought silence would earn me gratitude, about the years I spent waiting for someone to ask me how I was, while assuming they already knew. I wrote to forgive myself, not for being kind, but for making kindness a one-way street. "I forgive you," I wrote, "for believing that love without boundaries was noble. It wasn't wrong, but it was costly, and you paid in pieces of yourself." The letter stretched across 4 pages. By the time I reached the end, the rain had stopped, and the light outside had shifted a soft gold against the brick of the neighbor's garage. I signed it with my full name, Evelyn Marie Dorsey. I read it once, then again. I didn't cry, not in the way I used to. There was no heaving, no ache, just a quiet release, like exhaling after holding your breath too long. I folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box I keep beneath the bed, next to Daniel's pocket watch and my mother's rosary. I didn't intend to send it anywhere. It wasn't that kind of letter. It wasn't a bridge or a burn. It was a burial, a gentle laying to rest of the woman I had been, with full honor. That same evening, I lit a candle, a simple ritual, not for mourning, but for marking that I had arrived here, that I had endured the unraveling, and found, at the center, someone worth knowing. The next morning, I took out a second sheet of paper. This one, I addressed to Ruth. But I didn't write it out of anger. I didn't intend to scold or explain. I didn't catalog her failures or remind her of my sacrifices. That part of the story had already been written in receipts and voicemails, and meals forgotten. I wrote her a different kind of letter. Shorter. Still. I wrote, "Ruth, I hope one day you'll understand why I stepped away. I hope one day you'll remember me, not just as the mother who made everything run, but as the woman underneath it all, the one with a heart and dreams and thresholds." I paused, then continued, "I know you were doing your best, but sometimes our best isn't enough for someone else's survival. And that has to be okay. I still love you. I just had to start loving myself more." I didn't sign it, Mom. I signed it, Evelyn. I placed the letter in an envelope, sealed it, then I burned it. Outside, in a shallow dish on the patio, under a sky that was turning the color of old hymns. The smoke rose in a thin thread, curling like a prayer that doesn't need to be answered. I watched it drift until it disappeared into the wind, and something in me loosened. Not in sadness, in surrender. The kind of surrender that doesn't mean defeat, but freedom. A week later, I found myself walking through the farmer's market, picking out fresh radishes and talking to the cheese vendor about goat's milk and aging times. He gave me a sample. I said it tasted like forgiveness. He laughed, but I meant it. Forgiveness had started tasting less like a forced smile and more like something you choose for yourself. Something you spread on warm bread because you want to enjoy it, not because someone else is watching. That night, back in my kitchen, I played a record Daniel loved, Ella Fitzgerald, who lives in Berlin. I danced a little as I cooked. Just me and the clatter of pans, and the sound of someone finally coming back to herself. Not the woman I was, not the woman I waited to be, but the woman I had finally chosen to become. A woman who writes letters she doesn't send, a woman who burns them not in rage, but in release. A woman who understands that sometimes we must say goodbye to the story others wrote for us so we can begin writing our own. My life is quiet now, not the silence of absence, but the stillness of something that's finally at rest. The mornings start slow. I wake up without an alarm, sometimes before the sun. The house holds its breath in those early hours. No children clattering down the hall, no voice calling mom, no weight of someone else's schedule hanging over me. I brew my coffee in the same old percolator, the one with the cracked handle, and pour it into the chipped mug that says best day yet. I found it at a yard sale 5 years ago, back when I was still buying things to make other people smile. Now, it makes me smile. That's enough. I sit by the window and watch the birds. There's a pair of wrens that built a nest in the gutter last spring. I named them Edith and Clyde. Every morning they chatter and dart and rebuild the same little home with scraps and threads, like it's their first time. I find that comforting. The idea that even birds, with all the instinct in the world, still have to practice belonging. Sometimes I think I'm doing the same, belonging to myself. There's a peace in routine, but mine isn't rigid. I walk when I want to, I sit when I feel like sitting. I read the same book 3 times if the mood strikes. I garden, though not as intensely as I used to. The roses grow crooked now, but they bloom anyway. I like them that way, a little wild, a little stubborn. They remind me of who I've become. Joe still comes by every Thursday. We have tea on the porch when the weather is warm, soup at the kitchen table when it isn't. We don't talk about our children much anymore. We've said all there is to say. Instead, we talk about the small things, what we're reading, what we're planting, what we've noticed that no one else seems to. There's joy in noticing, in letting your life be enough for its own attention. Once a month, I write something for the library newsletter, a little column called Still Here. It's mostly reflections, sometimes recipes, once a poem about socks. I don't write for praise. I write because it feels good to be heard, even quietly. Andrew visits now and then, not out of guilt, I don't think, just presence. He brings me pastries from the little cafe near his place. Tell me about work. Ask about my garden. He doesn't push. He doesn't ask why Ruth and I stopped speaking. I think he knows it's a long story with no clean ending. He doesn't need to hear it. He just sits beside me, drinks his tea, and listens when I do talk. That's a kind of love I've come to trust. As for Ruth, I haven't heard from her in several months. The last message was a photo of the boys holding a sign that said, "We miss you, Nana." No words, just the image. I stared at it for a long time, not with pain, just with something softer, a recognition that what was lost can't always be repaired, but it can be remembered gently. I don't know if she understands yet. That's not my responsibility. Understanding doesn't always come in time for forgiveness. Sometimes it comes too late for reconnection, but just in time for reflection. I hope she reflects. I hope, one day, she looks at her own hands and realizes they held more than they acknowledged. That love, when it's given without demand, still deserves to be honored. But I'm not waiting. I no longer build my life in the shape of what might return. I built it in the shape of now. There's a small shelf in my living room with things that matter. A photo of Daniel, not from our wedding or any big anniversary, but from a random Sunday in 1981, holding a spoonful of peach cobbler and grinning like a boy. A stone I picked up on a walk the day I rewrote my will fit in my palm like something that was waiting to be held. A letter opener shaped like a bird, gifted to me by Joe, with a note that said, "For opening only what you choose." And a jar, a simple mason jar filled with slips of paper. Each one holds a sentence I've written to myself, not affirmations, not mantras, just truths. I made soup today and it was good. I sat in silence for an hour and didn't feel alone. I said no without apologizing. I matter, even when no one is watching. Sometimes, when the world feels heavy, I pull one out and read it aloud, not for validation, just for remembrance, because it's easy to forget your own voice when it's been an echo for so long. I walked to the post office twice a week. Not for mail, I hardly get any now, but for the ritual of going, of being out in the world, of exchanging nods with strangers, of feeling the sun on my back as I make the slow walk home. The woman behind the counter knows my name. That's more than I could say for some of my family. Once, she asked if I had grandchildren. I said yes. She asked if they visited often. I said no. She looked uncomfortable, like she'd asked something too personal. But I smiled. They're growing, I said. That's what matters. It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't the whole truth. But some truths are too heavy for casual conversation. My life is quiet now. There are no big reveals, no dramatic turns, just days that arrive softly and leave with grace. I no longer feel the need to justify my solitude. It isn't loneliness. It's presence. It's the space I needed all along but never dared to take. I think of Daniel often, not with grief, but with gratitude. For years. For the laughter. For the way he always saw me, even when I was too busy being useful to look up. I sometimes imagine what he'd say now, if he could see me sitting in my chair, painting a crooked little vase full of wildflowers. He'd probably smile and say, "You finally stopped fixing everything." And I'd say, "Yes, I finally did." And that would be enough. It is enough, because I have nothing left to prove. No more rooms to be erased from, no more meals to make to earn my place. I've returned to myself fully, quietly, entirely, and as I sit here now, on this gentle spring afternoon, with the window cracked open and the breeze carrying the scent of blooming lilacs, I know one thing more deeply than I've ever known anything. I wasn't angry. I was finally empty, and that was beautiful.